Once upon a time. Welcome to Australian Book Lovers, your destination for imagination.
Welcome, book lovers, to episode 105? 105. 105 of the Australian Book Lovers podcast. And of course, our mission is to bring fabulous Australian and Indigenous literature to book lovers around the globe. And not only all of those genres, but we also have fantastic resources and information for passionate authors looking to write their next bestseller. I'm Veronica Strachan, aka V.E. Patton, fantasy, science fiction, memoir, picture book writer and voracious reader of many genres, your founder and one of your co-hosts today, coming to you from Wurundjeri Woi country, cold and chilly, and my co-host.
Yes, here I am again. So I am your co-host today. My name is Laurie Bell. I am a science fiction and fantasy author, Friday Fictioneer, flash fiction writer, reader, and I am already lost with my intro because I'm still practicing it, so that is fine. We're getting all the teething out.
We are getting all the teething out, and you'll notice we're going.
I was just going to say, and I'm also coming to you from Wurundjeri Woi country today.
Yes, which covers a great deal of distance in Victoria.
It really
does.
And
just some absolutely beautiful country. And so we are still a couple of hours apart, but still all of that is there.
Nice.
Now, Laurie, I want to talk to you about Friday Fictioneer a little bit later, put you on notice, those snaps you through, can tell me about it. But on this episode, we have, as people know, the fabulous Darren Kasenkow has left ABL to pursue his own interests and do a bit more of his own writing. Although when I caught up with him the other day, he said no, he was still pretty frantic, but that's okay.
Good on you, Darren.
We have two of his interviews still left to share. The first one being today's fabulous host, which is Simon Higgins.
Yes, and he was so amazing to listen to.
Absolutely amazing. Yeah. Has done so many things, and he's the history, the things that they're talking about, history, and of course, probably a big mistake to get Darren to interviewing, because between them, they and both from Adelaide, so there was a bit of Adelaide loving going on.
There was a little bit. I feel like we need to get in the Melbourne vibes just to co-balance that out a little bit.
Yes. Yes, indeed. So because we have, it's quite a long interview with Simon, because he's, his experience and his books cover so many things. We're not going to get too excited today about the before. We're going to sort of probably jump into the interview fairly quickly. But first of all, tell me about Friday Fictioneers. What is that about?
Oh, Friday Fictioneers. It's funny. I've been doing Friday Fictioneers for about, it feels like 10 years. It might be slightly less. It might be 8. Might be around that area. And Friday Fictioneers is an online photo prompt writing tool. So it is hosted by the amazing Rochelle, who is linked in everyone's, it referenced back in everyone's post, because she hosts the Friday Fictioneers. She's been hosting for a good 10 years as well. And she will post up a photo every week, and the photos sometimes are hers. They sometimes come in from various Friday Fictioneers who take amazing photographs. And we get that prompt once a week. And you basically write 100 words. So 100-word story every single week. It's regular. It's excellent. I almost say rehearsal, because it is. I've used it through the last however many years to expand and grow my writing style, and really get down to that concise, how do you tell a story in such a short amount of time. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I get good feedback, sometimes I don't. And then you post it on for me in Oz, it's usually on the Thursday, but they all go up for, hence Friday Fictioneers, they all go up for Friday. And there's a large community of us that post them. They're wonderful to read. It's incredible to see how many different stories can be told about one photo. That just, it really shows you just one little prompt can go in so many different directions. And there are contemporary writers, there are science fiction and fantasy writers, there are horror writers, and everyone comes up with their spin on what that photo prompts them to write about. It's a marvelous community, and everyone is so friendly. They all comment and respond on each other's work, which is lovely because that feedback it's instant, it's amazing. But it's also, over the years, I've really grown my skill set in describing something very quickly to get a feeling across, or a message, or a story, or whatever the prompt might trigger in me. And I've definitely gotten better over the years. If I go back to my early Friday Fictioneers prompts, they're okay. But these days I just really feel like that practice, and regular practice, and regular getting it together, putting it together, posting it, it also keeps my website up to date, and it keeps things moving. So hopefully people come to my website more often so that they can see the 100 words. It's also a great resource for other writers and other readers, and hopefully young adults and the kids that I talk to. It's a really clever way to write something short, sharp, quick, and just keep those skills going on a regular basis. And the last thing I'll say about it, which I literally just had in my head and it's disappeared again, is no, I think it's completely gone.
Okay. How can people find it? Tell us where Friday Fictioneers is listed.
So Friday Fictioneers, if you can actually Google Friday Fictioneers, you'll find it. And I'm actually going to just very quickly grab Rochelle's website so you can go. So Rochelle's website is it's rochellewisoff.com. So it's ROCHELLEWISOFF.com. And there is a link on every Friday Fictioneers to a tool that brings up the options. What is it called? So there's a fresh link that goes in each time. It's actually called Fresh Link, that lets you find everyone's posts. So we all post in a central location. But everyone also posts on their website, and it's linked. So you can then go along to everyone's websites. You can jump between all of them. They're absolutely marvelous to read. I get such a kick out of reading everyone's work, and it's great for trains or tram travel, or sitting in the car and bored waiting at the doctor's, just reading through these 100 words. So much fun.
Yeah, it's good.
So much fun.
It's good. It's good.
And of course, mine go up on solothefirst.wordpress.com.
Yes, which is in fact your website, not Laurie Bell. Solo the First, indeed, and we'll talk about why that is another day. I think the discipline of doing something every week and finding, even if it's just that 10 to 15 minutes to do your writing, that's fantastic.
And what's wonderful is when I started, it would take 10 or 15 minutes to come up with a story. Now I can bang it out in about 2 minutes.
Wow, that's great.
Because you pick up the prompt, bang, off you go. It's up and posted within 5 minutes. So it really teaches you some amazing skills as a writer, to just come up with those thoughts and just to get them down on paper. And you know what they say, write as often as you can, or whenever you can, or whenever you find time. So it's a great way of, I don't have much time, I can just bang this out quickly, and then
and away you go. It's good. It's good. I should take a lesson out of your book. But anyway.
And everyone can join. Anyone and everyone can join Friday Fictioneers, as long as you link back to the original post, and you've got the LinkedIn, the fresh links link. You can post, you can join, or just do it in your own time. We always copyright the photos back to the original person who took them. So if you reference the photographer with the photo, pop your links in and then go for it. And it really is a great way of practicing your writing.
Very good, very good. All right, thank you for that absolutely cold jump into things. I didn't even warn Laurie that I was going to ask her that, but
I've been Friday Fictioneering for so long. I think I could talk about it in my sleep.
This is a good thing. This is a good thing. Now, I think that without further ado, you know what? I'm just going to share one little thing with
Okay.
you, which is a little bit hilarious.
Show
So
me,
this is
show
from Tanya Packer, who I follow on social media and, follow back. She's a writer, a middle grade writer. I think she's
Oh,
in the US. I can't actually remember where. But anyway, Tanya, thank you. She put up a post on Instagram, which is hilarious. And my daughter and I like these we love the language, English language and that kind of thing. Cass is a mad Jane Austen fan. She loves Poirot. She loves all of those kind of older
wonderful.
language, and she loves
Mm-hmm.
the nuances in language.
Yep.
Tanya put up a post which was really just hilarious. So let me share with you.
Okay.
English is the only language where you drive in parkways and park in driveways. It's also the only language where you recite in a play and play in a recital. The word queue is just a Q followed by 4 silent letters. Jail and prison are synonyms, but jailer and prisoner are antonyms. When you transport something by car, it's called a shipment. But when you transport something by ship, it's called cargo.
That's true.
That is true. But this is my absolute favourite. Your fingers have fingertips, but your toes don't have toe tips.
It's true.
Yet you can tiptoe, but not tip finger.
Oh, that's hilarious. I love it.
You love
Wow.
it? Yes. That's clever. So no, I really
It
quite
does
like
show
that. So
how
thank you,
crazy
Tanya.
the English language is, though.
Yeah.
There are so many words like that.
Just absolutely weird. Yeah.
Yep.
Very good. Very good. Lots of weird word places to do. Without
Yes.
any more faffing on about me from me and
Or me.
chat. Oh, no. Let's say thank you once again to the fabulous Darren Kasenkow, and we are going to jump into the interview with the delightful and extremely informative author Simon Higgins. And of course, Laurie.
Yes, of course. So our audio, our interviews for a couple of weeks are still in audio format. So go and get yourself a cup of tea, have a drink, have a listen to the dulcet tones of our two lads today. And hopefully in a few weeks, we might even have interviews that have some video as well. We'll have to get Darren on video at some point.
Yes, so people
so.
can, and he can share with us his little cat, well, not so little cat, Bobby, who is just delightful and sometimes makes his presence known, and people won't be able to see, but I've got my little furry feline muse on the bench. And Laurie, you've got some news.
I do have some news. Only last night, my partner and I, Jerry, we picked up our 2 little new fur babies. So I actually did an interview with Pauline Yates just a week or two ago, about a month ago, and said that we were missing our poor fur babies that we lost last year. So I have been a bit distracted in the last day or so. So you won't see them at the moment because they're still sniffing everything they can possibly.
It's all new. And little rescues, which is lovely, you said.
Yes.
So.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
So they're adorable.
Okay. And now, seriously, off
Yes.
to the interview with Darren Kasenkow and Simon Higgins.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next author has a career roadmap so mind-blowingly diverse, with a list of achievements so long that I could spend a whole show just on his introduction. Here to talk about his latest book, Dragons of Dust and Dawn, and a whole lot more, might I add, our author has flexed his philosophical and disciplined approach as a former police officer here in my current fair city of Adelaide, I might add, then as a private investigator specialising in homicide, before embarking on an international literary journey that has resulted in 15 books, including 2 bestsellers, 2 Children's Book Council of Australia Notable Book Awards, shortlistings for Ned Kelly Crime Fiction and Aurealis Fantasy Awards, and a Fellowship of Australian Writers Award. Oh, and did I mention he is also a martial arts expert who has trained and competed in Japan, is a screenwriter for plays, animated films and television shows, and is currently teaching the craft of creative writing to students in southern China. So what can I say except Mr. Simon Higgins, welcome to the Australian Book Lovers podcast.
Thank you, Darren. It's great to be with you.
Absolute honour to have a chat with you. And with a history like that, you can probably guess you're going to get some thick and fast questions from my end, because there's so much I wanted to delve into. But the first question, I guess, so from police officer to prolific fiction writer for young adults. So my first question, when it comes to your pathway to writing, were those light globes on your pathway to writing always glowing bright, from a young age, or was the writing bug came as a sudden revelation that sort of saw you shift from crime fighting investigations to bringing what are obviously fantastic stories and adventures to a younger audience? So yeah, always a writer there waiting to come out, or was it a shift in pathways?
Yeah, I think I was always a writer struggling to get out, and it was to some extent about the timing. So the way it unfolded was I was a prolific reader as a child, thanks to my mother's influence. She was a real reader, and she was very into storytelling, and she was a great verbal, oral storyteller as well. My parents had traveled a lot, so they had a lot of interesting anecdotes to tell. And I read a lot. I started doing cartoons, or what we now call graphic novels, when I was very young, writing short stories. And by the time I was about 10, I was reading adult books, just chewing through them, and also studying areas that interested me in reference books. Then I kind of drifted away from that post-puberty into a big kind of, I had the Zoolander moment, who am I? Okay. And was kind of out there trying to find my identity, trying lots of different jobs, a classic drifter. And then I got into the police force because I suppose there was some sort of genetic pull happening. Most of my ancestors were professional soldiers, and thanks to a genealogist in the Irish wing of the family, I found out that if you go back even further than that, there were battlefield knights.
Oh, wow.
So serving in somebody else's cause, and, always kind of trying to get land, trying to lift yourself up to the next rung of society by fighting on a battlefield seemed to be in the DNA. And as a result of that, I didn't join the military because I didn't like the idea of living somewhere for 2 years and then going somewhere else and then fighting in some politician's war. But I joined the police force, so I was in a uniform, I was armed, I was serving the society, and that was the good old South Australian Police Force. I believe now its name has been kind of softened, but with the trends of the times, but we definitely called it the police force back in those days. I joined in 86. I resigned in 94. And that 8.5 years was pretty dynamic, pretty interesting. I was involved in one small riot in the tail end of Rundle Street during the Grand Prix. I think it was the very first Grand Prix. It was either the first or the second, but yeah, basically there was a guy who'd come over for it. I think he was a Texan country and western singer, and he was busking, and a bunch of drunken louts started stoning him with coins. And then one thing led to another, and then a young lady, for reasons best known to herself, got up on the balcony of the Stag Hotel and began performing her own particular brand of burlesque. And this led to more riotous, drunken behavior, and more and more cops came, and it just got quite crazy, and there were projectiles flying around. So that's an interesting Grand Prix memory. And of course, 86 was also in between a couple of waves of notorious serial killer cases in Adelaide. And I have to say, the City of Churches has a very cruel reputation attached to it, which is really unfairly attached by many wings of the media. I mean, City of Death, City of Corpses. I've met people when I've been traveling, and they said, "Where did you grow up in Australia?" And I said, "Adelaide." And they said, "Oh, was Hannibal Lecter living in your street?"
Come on.
And this kind of thing. So it's about the fact that those cases were sensationalized and reported on in a very intensive and heavy way, but they weren't actually more shocking or disturbing than stuff happening in other states of Australia. And they certainly were less frequent if you look at statistics. And I used to have a couple of arguments with people from Melbourne and say, come on, you guys, you went for a mass body count trying to do things on volume. cheating and, using gangsters, doing the whole underbelly thing. There were actually a lot less murders in Adelaide. They were just more creative.
I think it's just Adelaide's little fun way. Other states doing their big promotions, and that's our form of promotion to kind of say, yeah, come for a visit for the festivals, but otherwise nothing to see here, no reason to move here. Go along.
Yeah, well, I think the honour of festival theatre and the Popeye has to be defended here, in terms of fascinating tourism things to see. But I do take your point. Adelaide's always been quite innovative. As a policeman there, I noticed the difference in kind of thinking and mentality compared to a lot of other places that I've been. There's a lot less conservatism, a lot more openness to different things. And after a while, when the dark side of the police force became hard for me to deal with, and I started suffering PTSD, that was when I turned back to writing, even while I was making the transition out of law enforcement into civilian life. And I did that via becoming a private investigator. At that point, I kind of turned back to reading and writing to try and, I guess, save myself. And it really worked.
That's a beautiful testament then to the power of writing, isn't it? But you said you returned to writing. So was it, we sort of sketching ideas in the background, and or was there a point where, maybe just after high school or something, did you sort of go, oh, I could start writing and didn't, or was it just a case of that finding was the catalyst for you to delve into something that you always wanted to do?
Well, it was it's a bit of a case of, writer interrupted in a way, because when I was in my early teens, I started really manifesting, the potential, I guess, that was there, which I attribute to all my mother's wonderful input and people encouraging me. And so I started to write, and when I was at the tail end of primary school, I entered an international writing contest. It was a poetry contest patronized by Jose Feliciano. And Feliciano's opportunity, I actually won it. And that really kind of told me that I had something to offer. And then I went on to write in early high school 2 full-length novels. And I wasn't particularly interested in the sciences or in the physical, training, the sport side of it. But I was really obsessed with history and English. And so I began to cash out, I guess, this kind of future identity as a writer of historical adventures. And I'd always loved the Three Musketeers and Ivanhoe and early sci-fi, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells. I put a lot of effort into that, and I produced 2 books. One was called A Helmet Held High, and it was about the English Revolution and Oliver Cromwell losing one of his sons in one of the key battles of the English Revolution, and yet, according to at least his thinking, saving his country. And that book had real potential. I've often wondered what it would be like to go back to that premise and rework it now that I've had a bit of practice.
Quite a big and heavy theme for sort of high school writing.
Yeah. I think it was, and I think it was a foreshadowing. However, I established very clearly also at that age that sometimes creative ideas and sometimes enthusiasm about one's ideas can be very patchy, and even good writers can produce duds every so often. And I was nowhere near being a writer, let alone a good writer at that point. But my second novel, I can now only talk about really as a comedy routine, because it was the most awful, tacky rip-off. And I don't know what I was thinking. I think I had just lapsed back into my age group kind of mentality rather than the real kind of talent coming out and being manifested. So the second book was called Fangor Highland Savage.
Oh,
and it was
the most
it was the most god-awful rip-off of Conan the Barbarian, except it was set in the Highlands of Scotland. It had really ridiculous things in it which showed that when I was overexcited, I didn't really understand the importance of research. So one of the things that happened was a bunch of English knights go to kill Fangor, who walks around in the Highlands being pretty much almost naked most of the time. These knights come at him and they form a phalanx like Spartans, which is, I mean, I know there were shield walls, but this is kind of a bit ridiculous. And then, using his mighty broadsword, the intrepid Fangor cuts down a palm tree, which falls and crushes all the knights. And I remember taking a great deal of satisfaction typing on my old typewriter that my mother gave me, typing one finger at a time, the sentence, "and blood and guts sprayed out in all directions."
Oh, there's no better phrasing words than blood and guts when you're at that age.
It's pretty terrible. So when I kind of had to self-reflect on how I was going to survive mentally and emotionally after taking a bit of damage in the almost 10 years in total in the law enforcement world, I thought, okay, back to reading and writing. And while I was a private investigator working on a homicide case, I actually got the inspiration for my first published novel, which was Dr. Id, which was about a serial killer. And it was about a serial killer using the internet to select his victims and get information from them. And when this was written in 1998, the internet was much more of a Wild West compared to how it is today.
Oh, chalk and cheese, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, there were still bulletin boards, and there were comparatively few websites, and there was, nothing like the social media that exists in this century. And the whole culture of it was kind of like a shaky little foal with bandy legs on its feet. No one was even sure if it was going to really be a thing in the future. And a lot of people, even social commentators in the mid to late 90s, were saying that the internet was just this big teenage thing that was going to pass. And
well, didn't some of those teenagers buy like McDonald's.com and all the big names at about that time for a couple of bucks? And those same teenagers are absolutely multi-millionaires now. When that timid foal, should I say, the legs grew stronger, and suddenly they realized it wasn't so much just a teenager little toy.
Yeah, exactly. And so the internet world I was writing about was a kind of a brave, new, and somewhat unstable environment in which you could hack. If you had fundamental computer skills, you could hack much more easily than you can today. There were no cyber cops as such doing agent provocateur, kind of lure you in, kind of stuff like in the Artifice Girl movie. There was nothing like that happening. So it was a very interesting time. And when I wrote about it and I married it up with what I knew about law enforcement and crime scenes and profiling, apparently, and I mean, I've never said this of myself, but I'm told the net result was something a bit on the cutting edge side. No one had really written a story like this. No one had targeted a teenage reading audience with something as this. And I remember the two publishers were interested in it, Penguin and Random House, who, ironically enough, have since then fused. They've since become the one publishing corporation. And one of the publishers from Penguin said to me, "The book's amazing, the ideas are amazing, but we want to kind of blunt a few things because we think it's a bit disturbing for young minds." And I was like, are these the same teenagers that I know who play violent video games and are obsessed with historical killing and always sneakily want to watch really graphic movies about blood and guts and horror, or is this a bunch of Brady Bunch teenagers from some parallel universe that you think are your audience? And the other publisher, who was Mark McLeod from Random House, to whom I will forever be grateful for his courage, said to me, "Look, I think we publish it pretty much just as it is, and it's going to do one of two things. It's going to put you on the map, or it's going to get you blacklisted by the guardians, by all the well-meaning teacher librarians
or the gatekeepers
who want to protect the kids from crazy stuff. So you're either going to be wiped out on your first outing, or you're going to be there and you're going to be able to publish pretty much anything after that." Luckily, it was the good outcome. and the book got great reviews, got sold to a couple of other countries, translated, and so from then on I never looked back. I was unleashed.
Definitely sounds like you're unleashed there, Simon. And the reason why I was really curious about, that transition from police work and private investigation work to the writing world is because, I mean, yeah, sure, it's quite, well, it's not uncommon for someone to shift gears and move from one career and then publish a book or two, but that's not the case here, is it? You've written so much, so it was such a big pivot. And so, for example, let's start with the Tomodachi duology books or the series. So you've got the Tomodachi duology, and that's got the books The Edge of the World and also book The Forest of the Night, as well as you've also written the Moonshadow trilogy, which features the books Eye of the Beast, The Wrath of Silverwolf, and The Twilight War. And of course, the reason why we're here is your latest release, Dragons of Dusk and Dawn. So you just talked about that dawning of the internet, crime, serial killer, young adult book there, which I'd love to talk about a little bit later. But I'm curious because shifting from that to the Tomodachi duology and to the Moonshadow trilogy, they are of course set mostly back in time. And so I'm wondering, what is it about the historical landscapes that have captured your imagination so strongly? Because it kind of seems that seems to pop out a bit of nowhere. When I say out of nowhere, as in this conversation, because we've chatted about, stepping in, being a bit of a gypsy and stepping into the police force and seeing the dark side, and then letting the writing take you over, and then looking into the cyber stuff. And you did talk about potential Conan the Barbarian, but this is a whole two whole worlds setting back in time. Yeah, what captures your imagination so well about these historical landscapes, and where did all those books come from?
That's a great question. The progress of it was like this. My first three kind of books to establish myself as a published author were crime fiction for young adults, where obviously I traded heavily on my background, my knowledge, and my credibility to know what I was talking about, to make it darker and more believable, because I'd been there, I'd lived in that world. Then I got quite fascinated with the idea that the best way to keep writing good stuff was to also explore yourself. And one of the things that triggered me about this was reading about a lot of great writers from history, and I was fascinated about how they really were living their different personality aspects, the different slivers of themselves in the fan, if you like, of their personality. So, for example, Alexandre Dumas, who wrote The Three Musketeers and The Man in the Iron Mask, a lot of people don't know this. He actually was a trained duelist, and he actually fought a duel with swords against another guy once. And he hearkened back to what he thought of as a golden age of French chivalry. So in a lot of ways, and he also, he was a pretty crazy character. He also wrote cookbooks and had 40 mistresses. So he was really unusual.
Suddenly, I want to look back into the Three Musketeers now.
Yeah, it's just fascinating. When you really look into some of the great writers of history and writers you've enjoyed, and you look at what they were like in their private life and what they were obviously exploring. So after being, another part of myself, I guess, was I've always been passionate about the sea, and I've always been a scuba diver. I did a lot of advanced scuba diving courses, including shipwreck diving and deep diving and all that kind of thing. I sometimes joke about myself as being the very low budget version of James Cameron. If I had his kind of resources, I'd be, going to the Marianas Trench and down to the Titanic and all that.
The real home of the aliens, yeah.
And I loved his movie The Abyss, where he really unleashed his passion about the deep ocean and the mystery and the wonder of it. I started writing these kind of submarine world thrillers, the Thunderfish trilogy, and that was 3 stories with a vigilante submarine captain. And my premise was a weird one, and it was the idea that a rich billionaireess sees a slaughter of boat people, of refugees trying to make it to Australia to start a new life. And out of the trauma she suffers comes self-reinvention, and she takes her resources and becomes the Captain Nemo of the 21st century. So she does daring rescues and sabotages illegal whalers and hunts pirates, not to kill anybody, just to cripple them and get them captured and to rescue refugees. And this book turned out to be such a weird idea that it let me do all my kind of underwater obsessive stuff as well. But it really got the imagination of the audience. So Thunderfish was the first one in that set, and that was my first bestseller.
Shaking Time came before it, didn't it?
Yeah, Shaking Time was around 2000, and Thunderfish was kind of before and after that. It was kind of a three in the series, written with the slight intervals in between them. And the first Thunderfish book grabbed the attention of a couple of Hollywood studios, and my agent at the time contacted me and said they're really into it. The premise is so different. There's a lot of interest. We're working on it. We'll let you know how it goes. And they said, she said, someone's even mooted the idea of approaching Liv Tyler to play Kira Beaumont, the main character. Because,
okay, I could see that as an eccentric seafaring vigilante.
Totally. Because Liv has that kind of gritty side as well as being very beautiful and kind of otherworldly. And I said to my agent, if they make this movie just to meet Liv Tyler on set, I will swim all the way to America. You tell them. And, almost all authors have several stories of the one that got away. Well, this is the story of the Thunderfish that got away. It didn't end up happening. There were a couple of reasons. One was another writer's strike, like we're seeing in current times. But there were also some complications to do with the studio buyout and takeover and just bad timing. It didn't end up working out. But then after that, I asked myself, okay, so I've explored the cop side of myself, and I don't want to keep on doing that. I don't want to be typecast as, the guy that writes about that stuff. And I don't want to write endless Thunderfish books. I've kind of exhausted my, pouring my love of the sea onto the page, to use a kind of a fruity image. And then now where do I go from here? And I thought, well, the other obsession I've had all my life, which has sustained my interest in martial arts, has been my great love of East Asian culture and my great fascination for it. And the first time I had the finances to travel, as a very young man, I went to China, Japan, and the Philippines, and I was on this big journey of trying to find out what that connection was about. So as an author, I returned to that, and I started going to Japan. I was training with a group connected with the All Japan Iaido Federation. Iaido is the art of the samurai sword. And I spent a total of 7 years training in Iaido and making many trips to Japan, and eventually getting a Japanese master as my trainer who spoke zero English. So I had to learn to speak Japanese to be able to train with them.
Sugoi there.
Yeah.
But saying that, it must have been an interesting time, because at what time? So would that have been around the year 2000, was it? Because Japan would have been still a little bit, when it came to their martial arts, it's not exactly an open gate, is it, for foreigners to go and just absorb their tradition?
It was between about 2000 and about 2008. I put in those very busy 7 years, and I trained in Australia with a dojo on the Gold Coast affiliated with the All Japan Iaido Federation, which has royal patronage, by the way, which really authenticates it hugely. And when you consider that the Japanese royal family, according to legend, is descended directly from Amaterasu, the sun goddess, that's quite a pedigree. So I had both Gaijin and Nihonjin Japanese coaches, both in Australia and in Japan. And there was definitely a bit of a frontier pioneering element to it, because I had some really interesting experiences in Japan. At one point, many of the people I was competing alongside and against in contests were real full-blood samurai descendants with a very proud history, wearing clan mon on their peori jackets or whatever.
Not to
And I
be
remember
intimidate you or anything, no.
no, they were very well. The Japanese, of course, they're very polite,
True.
and many of them very, very warm-hearted and complimentary, and taking me as a brother and taking me as a foreign cousin who's come home. All this kind of nice, warm emotions. But one time, a guy came up to me, and he was, I'm sure he would have been nudging maybe late 80s, maybe early 90s. It's not unusual to see Iadoka competing at that age in Japan. It's a culture with longevity, and it's a culture with a lot of fitness into old age among a lot of people. And this guy came up to me, and he had we were on a mountaintop, we were at a shrine, we were doing a contest. You had to wear traditional clothing. He was wearing a katana, so was I, and I was in hakamas and a dogi jacket. And he walked up to me, and he had some pretty dramatic scars on his forehead. He looked at me, and he looked me right in the eyes, and he looked kind of interested, but also slightly fierce. And he bowed, and I bowed. And then he said to me, Amerikajin, are you American? And I said, yeah, Australiajin desu. No, I'm an Australian. And he nodded very slowly. And then to my great surprise, he spoke English. And he said, Australian, very strong enemy.
That's an interesting choice of
And
words.
then he said, Australian, very strong enemy. And then he bowed again and walked away. I chatted a couple of other people afterwards. I said, that guy has got to be a World War II veteran. And maybe the last Australian he came face to face with was on the Kokoda Trail or somewhere in Southeast Asia.
Mm.
And I said, what do I make of what he said? And one of the other Japanese friends of mine said, he just paid you great respect. And he's from an old samurai family.
That's got to have been one of the more, well, I wouldn't say intense, but a very memorable moment of your martial arts career.
Oh yeah, I always say that was my kind of Ken Watanabe, moment. Tom Cruise meeting Ken Watanabe in The Last Samurai. It was that kind of feeling where, the extreme politeness and etiquette of the culture, despite the fact that what he's thinking about is Australian, huh? Last time I met you guys, I had a sword in my hand, you had a bayonet. It was a very different kind of meeting. I mean, that was my take on it, but I'm possibly romanticizing it a bit being a writer. But anyway, I spent a lot of time in Japan and a lot of time researching the culture, and out of that came the Tomodachi duology and the Moonshadow trilogy. And the Tomodachi books really focus on the samurai kind of mindset and pride and how they deal with foreigners. And the Moonshadow books, in which there are absolutely no non-Japanese characters, are really about the world of the shinobi, the spy culture, most usually referred to by Westerners as ninja. And I did a lot of work. I went to the heartland of ninja culture, which is Iga Ueno, which is a mountain city that used to be a village, the home of the Iga Ninja Shadow Clan, and also to the village of Konan, which was the home of the Koga Ninja, over a couple of mountain ranges. And I interviewed ninja descendants. I trained with them. I learned to throw shuriken properly. I learned to use a blow dart gun. I learned about making aconite ninja poison. And I learned about their particular way of thinking and their mindset and their particular pride, which was also quite strong. I was amazed to find out that many ninja from history that we know about were actually children, and that most of them were Buddhists, which is, kind of bizarre. And so I wrote about all of this in the Moonshadow books and really brought it to life. The first Moonshadow book, Eye of the Beast, became my second big bestseller, and this one got me into America, the Indonesian market, Germany, and yeah, again, this book just keeps on delivering, and I still get fan mail and fan fiction sent to me about Moonshadow, which is really sweet.
Wow, that's a pretty incredible and very from me standing on the outside looking in, that's such a unique perspective and unique situation to be in. But look, for a start, let's talk about the cover art. So the cover art for both of the series is, obviously absolutely stunning. The colors are super vibrant, really classic illustration style, and definitely, feels like, every single Tokyo subway station when you pull in, there's got an amazing bookstore somewhere there, and that will fit right on the shelves there. With regards to the art, was that style of art always going to be used for the covers? Did you have that in mind, or was that more the publishers, or was that you? And of course, the big question is, has it been translated to Japanese? Because, I mean, what a bizarre and, very gifted position to be in, where you're celebrating East Asian culture, using their history, creating these beautiful stories, and sending that to places like America and Germany. And you yourself, of course, are an Aussie from down here in SA.
Yeah, it's pretty strange. I mean, I've always had this feeling of familiarity about a lot of East Asian culture, both Chinese and Japanese, which I've never been able to explain. More on that later, which connects with Dragons of Dusk and Dawn. But basically, the short story about Japan was, I was so surprised at the fact that when the Japanese took an interest in me as an author, it was not how I expected it to go. They basically had the reaction in terms of publishers that they liked the fact that I had told the Australian publishers I thought they should use manga anime style cover art with rich colors and, non-realistic looking characters. But what really was weird, and I mean, the artwork for the Tomodachi duology, since it was refreshed, has been done by my wife, Jenny, who's Chinese, who's a professional artist and an animator and trained at RMIT in creative media. And so can do amazing things with a digital brush, which is based on years of calligraphy brush training as well, which is really cool, really unique. Interestingly, the feedback I got from Japanese publishers was that they didn't think young Japanese readers would get into my samurai and ninja books because they were too unfantastic and truthful. What they were interested much more in was my non-Asian based, non-historical books, particularly the crime stuff and the dangerous adventure stuff. And they serialized them in Japan in Asahi Shimbun magazine, which is part of the Asahi Shimbun newspaper, which gave me a huge readership, but they wanted to do it in English. So I was like, what? I have all this connection with you guys and you don't want to translate it. You don't want to talk about the historical stuff. You want to do it in English and you want to concentrate on the crime and adventure. Okay, well, fine. So that was the path we went down. But something definitely happened while doing those books in terms of my self-exploration. And I'd advise any writer, to explore yourself, explore the things that really speak to you, and let that inspire you, because when you write about it, it will give you an edge and it will give you a kind of a confidence when you really connect with it that you might not have simply researching things because you think they will sell or because, they're popular at the moment. It's the old not another story about a magical boarding school syndrome. Please, find your own magic. In 2018, I had an ancestral DNA test because I really wanted to know where a lot of these tendencies came from. My late mother told me that from the time I was very young, I was always building wooden swords and shields and training with them and trying to get the technique right. And yeah, okay, all little boys do that. They all go through a stage where they want to play knight or warrior or whatever. She said, but with you, once you stop doing it, you were actually in dojos training and learning how to do it for real and learning all these different martial arts and really loving it. And you took to it like a duck to water, even though you're basically a bit of a pacifist and you don't like fighting. You'd rather talk your way out of things. And so I thought, what does this mean? Why am I always so attracted to Asian artwork? And I've always collected it and the languages and clothing. So when I had the ancestral DNA test, I found out that I knew I had English, Irish, Scottish, French DNA. I knew that was in there from the family genealogies, which is not unusual, a kind of a mixed batch in the British Isles. But to my surprise, I also found out I had a solid quota of specifically Scandinavian DNA, Viking DNA, and Asian DNA. Basically, I'm about as east-west as it can get. I come from the land of the
literal
ice
yin
and snow.
yang.
Yeah, exactly. I come from the land of the ice and snow. I also come from the land where the sun rises.
The rising sun, yeah.
And really strange. I thought, now how am I going to process this? How am I going to, get this out of my system? I've done the crime writer. I've done the deep diving explorer. I've done the guy finding his way back to some strange Asian connection. But how do I integrate this? This is the final chapter of who and what I am. I gave it a lot of thought. And in the end, I thought to myself, let's dive into Chinese history because I'm learning about it all the time. There has to be an untold story somewhere here. And then I found out that at the end of the Tang Dynasty, which had, at one point in its history, it was like the golden age of Chinese dynastic development. Chang'an, which is now the city of Xi'an, which was the capital, was the largest city on planet Earth. And it had ambassadors and diplomats from all over the known world. And the Tang, through intermediaries, traded with Middle Eastern and the kind of the declining leftovers of the Roman Empire. The Tang had high technology from anybody's point of view. They had incredible science and openness and interest in other countries. And at the end of their dynasty, when rebels destroyed the capital and overthrew the kind of the weakened later waves of Tang rulers, they burned all the records of the Tang's achievements and travels and exploits outside China. They systematically did that. So the question I asked myself was the classic authorial what if. What if Tang Dynasty explorers were sent during the height of their empire's power to go as far west as humans could go and find out what lay beyond the horizon and chart and survey and explore and make new trade connections for the emperor, for the son of heaven? And what if during that exploration they confronted the struggling Anglo kingdoms under attack by the Vikings? So you have a three-way collision of fascinating cultures. You have a kind of an emerging Christian culture with a vision for national unity, kind of the Alfred the Great sort of mentality of a king. And you have these Vikings who, if you look into their culture properly, are actually far cleverer and more interesting and more forward-thinking than they're usually represented as being. And women have a more powerful potential role in their culture than is usually represented. And then you have these extremely scientific, Tang explorers who would have taken a mighty fleet, packing weapons undreamed of in the West at the time, and technology, which included, gunpowder and kites and folding trebuchets and, amazing things, all of which would have had very poetic names and intricate stories to go with them. So this is where the whole idea of Dragons of Dusk and Dawn was born. And then I just went to it. I went to researching very, very deeply and thinking about it and dreaming about it and developing the book.
I mean, far be it for me to bring any psychological viewpoints or anything along those lines, but I did recently have the pleasure of interviewing a lady who is one of Australia's premier experts on Carl Jung and all of his work and shadow work and heads the society here. One of the big topics, of course, was synchronicity and a lot of things. But here, as you're telling me that fascinating story, and then I'm starting to imagine, the Vikings and the Chinese and all these, the transporting so many amazing characters, so many different scenarios and really vividly unique circumstances. And then, of course, the book Dragons of Dusk and Dawn, correct me if I'm mistaken, brings together two characters, one from, I think, Scandinavia and one from China. Would that be right?
Yep, absolutely.
And so that, I guess, that's the key, isn't it? That's the two characters born from a DNA test. Would that be a fair observation?
Absolutely guilty, Your Honour. Guilty on all counts.
That's a beautiful scenario.
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that, that has been reading Sun Tzu's Art of War over and over again since I was a teenager. And of course, here in China, I've made many friends who've helped me to understand it even better and understand its application to life more broadly than just simply in warfare or business, which they see as another form of polite warfare. And then there's the other side of me, the side of me that was kind of let loose with martial arts, which just loves having a weapon in my hand and the whole risk and challenge and adrenaline and ferocity of engagement with somebody else. And particularly when I did Kendo, I loved this because, everybody was armored and you had a helmet on and you could actually make contact with each other. And that definitely, I'm sure, buys into the Viking kind of DNA side of me. And I reflected on this and I thought, well, have I ever really gone berserk, in that kind of way that you often see depicted in the sagas? Has the red mist, as the Vikings used to say, ever really taken hold of me? There were a couple of incidents in the police force where, we got jumped, my police partner and I, and we were unable to either use or get to our weapons, or it was against the rules to use them, and we were outmatched, outnumbered. Yes, I've always tried to use psychology to deflect actual engagement with violence and be a curbside shrink rather than a warrior in a blue suit, because that is the mission. And bear in mind, I'm talking now about an era of the police force where we did not have tasers, we did not have capsicum spray. We had a sidearm and a Monadnock PR-24 baton, the baton that's based on the martial arts weapon, the tonfa, with the side handle, the crank handle. You have to have a lot of skill to use that. There were times when struggling on the ground against a stronger person or more than one, I can remember just cutting loose and just like roaring and biting and headbutting and elbowing until I got enough control to go back to being a regular human being and say my lines like "you're under arrest" and get the cuffs out and all that stuff. So yeah, I thought there's a part of Einar, the warrior, young warrior leader of the Vikings, and there's a part of Hui, the Tang Dynasty expert in strategy and languages, that is part of each of them that is definitely me. And I'd love to see them face off and deal with each other in a situation, each according to their own destiny, and see how that worked out. So that's really what fired the engine room of the novel.
Well, I guess two questions that come from that. What is your writing process, and how long did it take for Dragons of Dust and Dawn? And was it a completely, compared to all the other books, do you think it was a unique, experience when it came to writing because of those elements?
Yeah. It was a joy to write. And it was almost like, some of the stuff I wrote after the police force was therapeutic because I was getting away from a very dark world and a very dark job. And instead I was doing something joyful and creative. And it was, ultimately going to be for young minds, all that stuff. This was therapeutic in a different way. This was finally working out the connections of some of the deeper, more subliminal or I don't know, almost past life type things of myself, and indulging that, which was a new experience. My process is I get a core idea and I sit with it for a while and I try and refine it until it's really strong and I can put it in a simple shout line or a long sentence or a short paragraph. And then I research it intensively so that I become a kind of a mini expert on the subject and I know what I'm talking about, and I can write about it with some authority. And of course, one of the great things about being a long-term martial arts student, particularly one that trains not only unarmed but with weapons, means when I do fight scenes in any of my books, they're choreographed, they're checked, they're tested, they're completely credible, and they're accurate to history. So they may actually have happened just that way at some point in history, and if not, there's no reason why they couldn't have. And that's part of my kind of criteria. So I research, and then I sit down and with a certain amount of abandon and joy, I just write the first draft, using all the research knowledge, using the enthusiasm based on the basic premise. Then I let the characters, as they're unfolding on the page, I let them come to life. If it works, if the process works the way it's meant to for me, to some extent, they then start hijacking the story. And then I get this almost kind of weird internal struggle with some of them where I had planned a rough outline and what I want to see happen roughly in each of the chapters or the scenes. And then I come to one of them and I can almost, and for the benefit of any people in the psychology profession who are listening in, I wish to emphasize the word almost. I can almost hear my characters saying, no, wait a minute, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have said that. This is what I would have done. And I have this kind of little mini struggle with them, and I let them win usually. And then I feel like the magic is starting to flow.
Well, you used a really cool word there in describing that, and that's hijacking. You know, the characters eventually hijack it, or the story. That's one of the good things about writing, isn't it? The characters come to life. At first, we are the creators. You know, as a writer, we jot down, or however each of us in our writing style, you know, brings these characters to life. But from the initial point, they exist as a concept, and then we slowly flesh them out. And at some point, it becomes a conversation as opposed to a one-way interaction, shall we say. And
absolutely.
And then as soon as that conversation starts, then all bets are off the table, because there may be whole different scenarios that you're going to explore, because now there's two of you making the decision.
That's very true, Darren. And also the idea that, in my experience at least, as a writer, there are some questions about where I'm going to take subplots, where I'm going to take certain themes that when I start writing, I can't answer them. But once the characters come to life, they take care of that for me. And then I know where it's all going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that goes along the line of that premise that a lot of writers find out certain themes that they've accomplished within their work only through by other people reading it, and then those readers letting them know that those themes that they discovered. Of course, sometimes it's the first time that comes to the reader's attention.
I remember when Thunderfish became a bestseller, I was at a writers' conference, and I was sitting on the platform and I was being interviewed, and the lady who was the adjudicator and interviewing each of the authors brought up Thunderfish and talked about the unusual premise, you know, the girl with the submarine and all of this. And one of the things she said really took me by surprise. She'd obviously done her homework and even read the book, which was wonderful. And she said, I loved how Kira, at the beginning, when we see her surrounded by her bodyguards, recovering from the death of her father, just before they blunder into the refugee incident in the Coral Sea, north of Australia, I love how the name of their very opulent private yacht that they're on is the Ithaca. Obviously, you were invoking the Odyssey and Homer because this is, you know, you're really subtly signaling there in classical terms that this is going to be a classic hero's journey and transformation. You know, as Odysseus made his way home to Penelope, Kira's going to make her way home to herohood. And I was like, Ithaca, yeah. Oh, I mean, yes.
Absolutely, yes.
Of course, yes. I mean, one always tries, for the benefit of the audience, to invoke the classical canon. Yeah, it was really like that. I was taken by surprise, because the real reason I called it Ithaca was Kira Beaumont was partly inspired by Athena Onassis, who really was this lonely, isolated, surrounded by bodyguards, highly intelligent, with hooded, haunted eyes, young heiress, whose father had had a shipping empire. And I thought, well, you know, her dad was Greek, so it would kind of make sense if all the ships were named after different islands in the Mediterranean. And I just pulled Ithaca out of the hat kind of thing, and that's actually how it happened. But yeah, as you say, new insight and new interpretation gets put on things after the audience absorbs it and has their own resonance with it. And I'm sure now, as Dragons of Dusk and Dawn makes its way out into the world, and it's already gone to number 3 on Amazon in its particular category, which is, you know, historical medieval YA. Thank you. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of, you know, feedback. Had some great reviews already from readers. I'm sure as critics get hold of it, there's going to be some stuff coming up where people are going to share with me about their own kind of connection with Einar and also with Hui, because there's a scholar and a warrior in most of us. As you said very astutely earlier on, there's a real yin-yang kind of joke in here to the whole thing. The idea also that the Vikings were just kind of crazy berserkers who, face painted with blood and ran haphazardly into battle, and because they were big men from Scandinavian countries generally won, is a lot of nonsense when you really look into their history. What brilliant seafarers they were, how inventive, what accomplished traders they were. And I mean, look at the fact that according to formal Russian history, the Slavic peoples who were constantly interacting with the Vikings down the rivers flowing into the east from the Scandinavian countries and that part of the world are said to have invited the Vikings to become their rulers because they wanted ferocious, intelligent people to take charge of a country constantly warring against itself. Now, what's crazy is when you read what a lot of historians have said, there are many historians who think it might actually be true. Now, that's a bizarre idea. And when you look at it, the word Rus, from which we get the word Russia and Russians, the Rus originally meant in the Slavic tongue, the Vikings, those guys who come down the rivers. Sometimes they raid, sometimes they trade. They're big, have long hair, which they're constantly combing. When they're trading, they're very jovial. When they're raiding, they're, terrifying and formidable. And we want them to take over the country. This kind of stuff, and the fact that the Vikings made it to North America, that the environment didn't enable them to successfully plant a colony there, but they did so in Iceland. And, why did they do this? They were driven by a survival imperative. They weren't just kind of, trying to take over the world. In fact, they weren't trying to take over the world at all. They were trying to exist. And the weather patterns at the time, the fact that every time they did make headway with farming or with trading and raiding, up went the population. Then the bad weather came. Then a lot of that population starved. And so they were in this cycle they needed to break out of. There was a lot of intelligence and a lot of adaptability there. And I wanted to explore that and how that would react to confronting the Chinese, who by that period of their history, the Tang era, had turned warfare into a fine science, which not only had systematic principles that took in everything before making a decision, but also had a number of philosophies behind it, which they were very, very serious about. I thought, what an incredible series of conflicts could come out of this, and also philosophical questions for the reader. How do you respond to conflict, and what would you have done? And is this courage or madness? Is this really nobility or condescension? All these kind of questions.
It almost sounds as though it's the meeting of, a warrior of the heart versus, or at least the coming together of the warrior of the heart and a warrior of the mind.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, because Einar is doing what he's doing, not only for the things he's been conditioned to believe in from an early age, that, a man in his culture seeks glory through conquest, through raiding, through struggle, through daring, through having deeds that can enter the songs of men and can qualify you to one day enter the portals of the bright halls, to enter the afterlife and be among the gods, feasting with the people who you call out to in battle for support. Not only that, but also on a pragmatic level, he wants to save his people. And he's got a vision, and he's got an advisor called Sten, who's like a blood brother to him, who's much less of a fighter and much more of a thinker. And there were many people like this among the Vikings in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark, who thought deeply about the implications of the future. And so he's got a vision for the idea of, we don't just force our way into another country, but we see if we can keep part of it. And of course, this really, in the end, is part of the reason why I have the DNA I do, and why most of the Irish people who, alongside the Chinese, particularly in the southern half of the country, helped build Australia, whether they know it or not, most of them have Viking DNA, because at one stage Dublin was Viking central, and many English cities were part of the Danelaw. They were part of England that had become essentially Viking. And that made the country, in many ways, after a number of early conflicts, much more powerful. And science tells us that the more you have kind of an integrated gene pool, the more you're likely to have talent, intelligence, outstanding things going on at large in the population. And conversely, I'm often amused by the image that arises sometimes when I hear people talking about China and the Chinese, and they say, yeah, I guess most of the Chinese who are very influential have been pure Han Chinese. Well, Han is just the name, not only of a famous smuggler in all of our favorite science fiction franchises on the screen, but Han is really just the name of the first kind of significant organized dynasty, which a lot of people look back to as being where they come from. But if you talk to Chinese people here who've had DNA tests, they will tell you that they found out to their surprise they had Han Chinese blood. That's the people of the black hair from the Central Plains from ancient times, but also Mongol blood, ethnic minority groups such as the Yao, the Zhuang, who live in the province that I live in, and an enormous smattering of bloodlines which has come into the Chinese people, including from the Middle East, which has empowered them, and from the far north, which has empowered them, like the Jurchan and so on. So yeah, very, very interesting. I think the world's real face, real identity is much older and more blended than we suspect. And this is why the whole notion of us and them is so crazy and so misplaced and so unhelpful and generally used to underpin nasty ideologies.
One of the most interesting things for me about having the opportunity to talk to amazing authors just like yourself is, me being an author, I love my science fiction. I write dystopian, horror, sci-fi. I love nonfiction and philosophy and all that sort of stuff. For some reason, history has never been something that I've traveled that road much, and not for any particular reason, just hasn't been there. But the more that I talk to people who have their, 1 foot solidly placed in history, the more that I'm really starting to see, the absolute, beauty of it. And combine that with, you talking about the DNA test, and that's something I've thought about for quite some time. I'm thinking maybe it's time I'll go get one. But it really does, talking about DNA and then, all that going back in history and all those different elements of the cultures and the societies that little bits and pieces may be a part of each of us. So, of course, as you said, which would make it pretty silly for us to be able to listen to any propaganda and go fight a person who maybe some of their culture might be embedded in our very blood. But isn't it a beautiful thing that by telling stories like this and also by you doing your DNA, but it really does show that, it's too easy to sit here today and feel like we're separate to history. At least that's what I do a lot, whether not intentionally, but I feel like history is something that's not part of my life. Whereas in fact, as the more I look into it, the more I hear people talking passionately like yourself, the more I grow to realize that no, I'm a unique feature of that history. I'm just a different moment in time, but of that same thread, of that same blanket, that same, plot line that goes back 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 years, maybe longer. I'm on that same line, but whether I want to turn back and see my position or not will depend on, whether I get a better understanding of my place in the world or not.
That's true. That's a profound thought, and I think, at the beginning of the book, in the acknowledgements and preface, I kind of appeal to people to consider having a DNA test simply because it can be not only inspiring, but it can be a revelation about where some of our inherent drives come from, some of the tendencies we've always had, which we may not be able to explain. And I mean, I'm not saying that, genetics totally dominate who we are and what we are, but they are definitely profoundly influential. And I think also alternate histories where we ask questions about, well, could this have happened? And what if this had happened? I think that's a really rich area for authors like you to perhaps experiment with in the future, because in a way, all history, even that which we take for granted, is alternate history. It's one set of interpretations. It's based on two things that really hold it back. First of all, a lot of history is written by whoever won. It's written by the winners.
Yeah, that's right.
We didn't get to hear the other guy's point of view. We didn't get to hear their truths, their reasons. And secondly, so much of history has been lost. So much of history has been destroyed. If you think back to the burning of the great library of, Alexandria in Cleopatra's time, the destruction of so many books of the ancient world, which if they had made it through to us, translations of them, we would have such a completely richer and different understanding of where we all come from, but we don't.
No, I think that's like getting a concussion to the global brain. There's stuff that's just gone now that's never going to come back.
Totally. And you think of, in both East and West at different times, campaigns of destroying knowledge, of book burning, of wiping out previous histories because they had a different religious viewpoint or a different ideological or political viewpoint, or they were simply from a different dynasty or bloodline. And these tragedies offer storytellers opportunities. They offer the opportunity to research around the fringes of what we do know and go back and propose different things. And I noticed that, nowadays, a lot of the kind of the sci-fi fantasy superhero franchise has been forced to turn back to history. And the usual device they use, which is a pretty well-known device to sci-fi writers, of course, you'd know this one backwards and have probably used it yourself, which is the old, alternate history or parallel history, multiple universes, time travel. Any of those kind of devices enable you to send your characters on journeys where they meet historical figures, they meet themselves, alternative versions of themselves. And it's interesting that this continues to fascinate humans. This continues to fascinate people as another way of telling another hero story. I find that really interesting. I would have thought by now, after many years of, Marvel and DC movies, we'd all be getting over it a bit, over the capes and cowls and powers, and yet not. It seems to be hanging in there, and I think it's largely due to this device. So when you pluck a period of history and say, well, what if this happened? Or you write with great authority as if it did happen, that framing really produces almost like a whole new genre.
From a scientific standpoint, I'm not too much of a fan of the multiple universes theory or multiverse theory, but the concept of going back and looking at a particular moment in time and maybe looking at what could have happened, like you said, because so much of what we know about the past is really an interpretation or essentially, a very fine dance, very slow dance, very subtle dance between fiction and truth. There is absolutely every opportunity to go back, and if there is a moment in time that it draws someone in for a particular reason, what's to stop them doing the research, see what stories have already been told, and add to that lore and tell their own story and go back in time and just to see what might have happened.
Yeah, I agree, and I think what I've done with Dragons of Dusk and Dawn is proposed a historical what if, which actually is very credible in terms of one or two major archaeological discoveries, hopefully in my lifetime or thereafter, could actually make the book move from being fiction to being a fictionalized history. And crazily enough, we know that suddenly elements of Chinese culture, including war technology, appeared in Europe during the Dark Ages, during medieval times. The most obvious glaring example being the crossbow. But we don't know how. We don't know how 1 minute it seemed like there were only longbows going on in intercountry wars in Europe, and then suddenly in the United Kingdom and on the continent directly opposite them, people had crossbows. People had Chinese crossbows, and then they had their own hybridized version of it, and it all happened quite fast. And it's not enough to say, well, they made their way down the Silk Road along with the silks and the jewels and all the rest of it, because that process had been happening for hundreds of years beforehand, and this hadn't happened, the sudden integration. And also shifts in tactics and shifts in the way certain things were handled, and a greater openness to the idea of assimilating enemies, doing deals with them, and then deploying them as an asset, which the Romans, of course, had done, which the Han Chinese, contemporary with the Romans, had done, which the Tang dynasty made a fine art out of. All of these things just suddenly seem to fire up within a generation. And so my premise is, what if something like this happened, the events that you see in Dragons of Dusk and Dawn? What if this is the catalyst, this kind of occurrence? And the presence of the Tang in Europe, yes, it would have been charted, it would have been detailed, there would have been exhaustive records meticulously written by Chinese bureaucrats, but we know that all of the records of the achievements of the Tang were deliberately and, quite sadistically burned. So that really, really gives me a lot of license. That's my kind of easy out.
Well, no, I wouldn't call that an easy out at all. I'd call that an invitation.
Yeah. Although I do have to say, Darren, just regards to what you said before, I do agree with you that there's always that danger with science fiction. The moment you're relying on a kind of a fairly imagination streaked pseudo-scientific theory, or unproven or unprovable scientific theory, no matter how good the original Einsteinian, physics on a whiteboard might have looked, the moment you're relying on that as a core feature of a storyline, it does attract the same criticism that you can get about the whole Harry Potter phenomena, where some people said, look, the characters are adorable and the hero's journey is great, and there's a lot of great classical research in there, but at the end of the day, it's unsatisfying because they can always fall back on just finding one more spell, one more magical object, so there's always going to be an easy out. But I do happen to know for a fact, thanks to my friend in Beijing, a scientist called Dr. Wu, that in a parallel universe, there is another Darren who writes parallel universe sci-fi novels. I just thought I'd drop that in there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I sort of went down that rabbit hole the other day when I was doing a bit of a long drive, and it's something I'm always reading about. And I was thinking, ultimately, at the end of the day, hearing all these scientists talk about the multiverse and that concept of every split moment in time, from a super state, then it breaks away, but by that moment in time, there's equally a close to infinite alternatives that have also broken away and formed their own, and the list just goes on and on. I thought, well, then there is that. Congratulations, that strips all purpose from everything. And if we want to go down that road, then what's the point of anything? It to me, it was just like, that really is. It sounds exotic, but it's just stripping away any purpose. I mean, what purpose is there? And what value is there to anything? Especially, I guess I come from that philosophical sort of landscape thinking of, we are limited to, as human beings, as far as what we have to interpret, to be a part of the world, to see the world, smell the world, taste the world, hear the world, feel the world. I mean, obviously we only see a certain range of colors. Every animal has their own different spectrum, but ultimately we're victims to the point, or sure, not victims, but we're limited by our nervous system and the sensory input data that's sent to our brain and how our brain interprets that. So whether, what I see is not necessarily what's there, it's just the interpretation. My biological and electrical and psychological and neurological and all those fun, heavy words, they'll come together and give me an ability to see something that I say is nature, but it's an interpretation of nature. I can't see what's really there that might exist beyond just my, lens. And I think it was, was it Robert M. Pirsig, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? He was talking about, at what moment from that beyond void where we can't see, touch, smell or anything, when we get that interpretation, at what point in that do we assign beauty to that part, that microsecond of interpretation. And then thinking of that in the multiverse, then again, that beauty is taken away because there is no way to assign beauty because everything is everything. Everything's unlimited, it's infinite. So, but yeah, there's my little random side note for a bit of philosophy and multiverse.
This is partly why I made a point of having my characters express their own kind of take at different points on how they see the meaning of life or how they see destiny or fate. Because on the one hand, although the Vikings very clearly did believe that some people had fates, some people had their own particular path or destiny waiting for them that were woven in the roots of Yggdrasil, the tree of the worlds, by the Norns before the dawn of time, they also believed you could breach your fate or prove that another fate that came out of your will was possible through incredible deeds. And that's a really interesting idea. That's a kind of a, having your cake and being prepared to hijack it at some point approach. Whereas the Chinese, in the time of Kui, the character who's the main character you deal with in Dragons of Dusk and Dawn, he's a Taoist, and his philosophy derives from the Tao Te Ching, which is basically about acceptance of situations, the way things are, the flow of the river of life. And it doesn't make you passive, but how you deal with it is much more subtle and elegant than the Viking idea that if I want to prove the Norns secretly meant me to be a king, I may need to find a rival king and assassinate him and replace him very daringly. And then that proves that's my fate. So these are really interesting ways of looking at things that I wanted to contrast in the story.
It's interesting, so about having that balance between, on one hand, you've got like that determinism with free will thrown in, and then you got the Taoists who, be the river. And then you referenced the Viking that needed to prove that perhaps fate was, had a particular thing in store. Where does Simon Higgins fit in this as far as your viewpoint? Do you think we, as a human being and on this journey called life, do you think we have that balance? Do you think we have some element of fate and some element of free will in the sense of we can step away from our fate, whether we want to or not, or whether we mean to or not? Or do you think there's a certain path that we're all destined for each of us in our own individual way to take? I mean, for example, your fate that you may have perceived at the start of your career as a police officer certainly would have been not the fate that was meant to be. So do you think fates change, or are you on a journey to an overarching fate?
That's a really excellent question. I think we could do an entire weekend seminar just on that one question. I best answer that with an anecdote, which I think is more interesting too for the listeners. And that is that years ago on one of my last trips to Japan, my sword teacher, who was Japanese, we went out and had a bite to eat together and a few drinks. And then we went for a walk down the Kamo River in Kyoto, which is a very, kind of atmospheric place. The Kamo River flows through the city. And Kyoto, of course, is full of eagles. And there's eagles perching on a lot of the buildings. Most cities have pigeons. Kyoto has eagles. And one of the reasons there are so many eagles is there were great battles fought all through the Sengoku Jidai, the great age of warring states. Battles fought in and around Kyoto between samurai armies and just out of town. And many times the river, which in the part that flows through the town or through the city is quite shallow. Many times it ran red with the blood of fighters. And the eagles apparently multiplied over the generations in population because they constantly had bodies to feed off, vulture style, which is, kind of a bit disturbing. When you're driving out in the bush in Australia and you see the wedge-tail eagle picking away at the roo that's been brought down by a truck, you don't think in terms of historical events and massive battlefields and the same kind of thing happening.
No, that puts a real different twist on a beautiful day on the banks of a river in Kyoto, doesn't it?
It does. And as evening fell, we walked along the banks of the river, and there were young people playing musical instruments and sitting around, and it was a nice ambient night. And my sword instructor said to me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Oh, are there any fortune tellers? I'm always interested in seeing what kinds of divination people are using in different parts of Asia." We found a little area where there was a couple, and there was a guy sitting on the banks, and he had a little stall set up and a little sign, and he had this gadget that he said operated off a kind of a I Ching type system, but it didn't use coins. It used blocks of wood that had different characters carved into it. And he had a calculator, and he had a big notebook, and he did lots of complicated things before he gave any kind of a reading. I'm an police officer and private investigator. I've had scientific training. I'm fairly skeptical of people who say they have any kind of precognitive powers. But I'm also open to the whole idea that there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophies or our philosophies. I sat down with this guy and I said, okay, ask him, I said through my sword instructor, I said, ask him if he can do a reading for me. Paid a small sum of money, and then he did his calculations. All he wanted to know was my date of birth and my full name. And then away he went. And the calculations went for ages and ages and ages. And I thought, oh, this has got to be smoke and mirrors. This has got to be the snake oil serum. It's got to be a performance. And then he said this. He said, I'll tell you something about your past. I'll tell you something about your present. I'll tell you something about your future, but you can choose the future question at the end. I said, okay, go. He said, your past is you were in a job that involved a kind of being a hunter. And you had to be very scientific and very pay a lot of attention to detail. And it was all about fixing situations or reversing situations. And many times you didn't get the result you want, and you were very frustrated, but you were very earnest about it. And in the end, it started to pull you apart, so you had to leave it. And then you began to do something purely creative. And now you are happy. Now you've found your path. And I was like, okay, statistically speaking, that did not at all necessarily have to be accurate, but it was.
Mm-hmm.
I said, what about my present? And he said, now you are pursuing yourself. Now you are working out who you are. And that's why you're in Japan. Can you give me any more detail on that? He said, you knew years ago you would come here and do this, but you will only do it for a certain season. And then you will have your answers and you will move on. I thought, this is getting more and more interesting. And then he said, what do you want to know about your future question? I said, okay, let's really up the ante. I said, how will I die? And he said, most people don't want to know this. I said, I do. Tell me.
I was going to say, that was a bit of a different question to throw out there.
Yeah, I said, come on, tell me, how will I die? And of course, I guess this is, again, the Viking side of me is kicking in, and I'm throwing back my head and roaring, again, in my heart, He looked at his notes, his extensive calculations and all the little numbers and figures. And then he said again, are you sure you really want to know this? I said, yeah, tell me. He said, you will die at quite an unusually old age. I said, that's good news. And he said, but you won't die in your own land. You will die in a foreign land, and there will just be a small group of people around you. And just before you die, there will be a great silence. And I thought, that's really intriguing. That sounds like being buried alive in an earthquake or something. I definitely like the bit about an unnaturally long life,
Yeah, I was going to say, as far as an answer to a question like that, the first two parts were quite almost quite beautiful, but the sudden, or that moment of silence, I guess that, well, by its very nature, being silent, is open to interpretation, isn't it?
Yeah, my wife thinks maybe it's the whole world going silent and taking that last gasp as the comet bears down on us for the last few kilometers, But I said to the fortune teller, if you can really answer these questions and you can really calculate this stuff, how does it work? He said, what do you mean? I said, how does fate, life, what's possible work? In other words, I asked him the question you asked me. He said, okay. He said, I'm going to simplify this. He said, imagine that life is like a highway, each one of us get given a highway we can travel on, and the highway has a number of lanes. Some people believe anyone can do anything, but that's not true. He said, for example, a poor young African boy born in an African country can never decide, I will become the president of the United States and it will happen. That's just not one of the lanes on his highway. And you are stuck with your highway. That's what we call fate. That's what we call destiny. You can only ever be on this highway. It's yours. It was given to you and you're stuck with it. But within that highway, you can change lanes, and there are off-ramps, there are turn-offs, and there are places where people seem to leave the highway and then somehow get back onto it. And he said that is the easiest way I can explain it. The rest is very complicated mathematics.
Well, yeah, judging by the sounds of it, yeah, he definitely liked his numbers. But that's a pretty cool analogy, and I like that. There's that balance, isn't it? There's that freedom within determinism. Freeway determines which, the general direction you're going to head, and the different lanes you can choose, and each lane, having its different purpose. But at the end of the day, doesn't mean you can jump up to somebody else's highway.
Well, that's right. I have thought very deeply about benign world dictatorship for everybody else's benefit, of course, not my own.
Yes,
but
of course.
I feel it is not really one of the lanes in my highway.
No, and it's a good, in a funny way, there's a lot of freedom that comes with that concept, isn't there? When you sort of, as I'm thinking about it, just after you said it, having that freeway, that it gives me the freedom to go, phew, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to, well, in theory, and most likely not be able to do X, Y, Z. However, I do have the ability to have a good look at my lanes that I've got here and see where they can take me.
Yeah, and that's where the whole, the kind of the really wonderful side of human beings comes into it. The freedom to be an explorer, test the limits, test your own limits, go on that big quest, see what's beyond the horizon, beyond that mountain range. And I think that is the wonderful side of man, potentially, man in the generic sense. My characters are mindful of this stuff because in their worlds, and in a lot of points of history, people dug into this kind of motivation, this kind of philosophical motivation to give them perseverance, to give them the grit to keep going when it got difficult, and interpreted things in that way. And, it's funny, today we talk about people who say, well, there's one guy says the glass is half empty, the other guy says the glass is half full. And then you have this kind of image of Vikings making a crossing, heading west, going to do raids for survival with a certain edge of desperation on it. And they get caught in a storm and the thunderclaps are rhythmic. And one Viking's attitude is Thor is pounding his hammer on his anvil to show that we didn't sacrifice enough. We didn't consult the gods properly. This was ill-advised. We're going to be punished. We're going to go down. And another guy says, no, Thor is beating on his anvil to fan the winds, to drive our sails, and also just to remind us that we're not going to do this without a lot of courage. So chin up, boy. Come on, let's do it. Let's go, And that's really interesting that humans do this. We dig into what we believe and we want it to support what we want to believe, like a kind of a circular motion. It's very interesting.
Yeah, you get four people, and let's say they each have to help hold up a very heavy cube, but each side of the cube is a different color, and you're holding it up, so you've got an opportunity to look around and see what other people's colors is. You have to take their word for what color they have, and then of course, give it enough time, and those four people holding that massive heavy cube will start arguing, A, that they don't believe the other person's color, and B, that they have the best color.
Yeah.
and none of them will stop to say, hang on, but we've all got the same cube. So I think that's human beings, really, isn't it?
It is. And one of the illustrations of the kind of the richness of culture that I hope comes across in Dragons of Dusk and Dawn relative to complex Chinese culture. There's a scene where Kui is talking with one of his bodyguards, one of the guys who's a guard and a bowman, and is going to escort him with a team to the shores of the British Isles to do a survey and try and make an assessment of languages, because Hui is a language expert. And this guy's name is Du, Guard Bowman Du. And Du says to Hui, you know, you'll have these journeys, we'll all have these journeys, but in the end, you know, it'll be fate that tells us what we're really going to end up doing or being or experiencing. And Hui says, you say that with a great deal of conviction. How come, you know? And Du goes on to explain that he was serving on the western frontier of the empire, and he was a soldier, and he got in a drunken fight with another soldier, and he killed the other guy, and he was thrown in the stockade, and he was awaiting execution. But while he was awaiting execution, before they could take him out in the morning and behead him, the whole base of soldiers, the whole frontier base, was attacked by horse tribesmen, you know, kind of like the Mongols, one of those many groups from that part of the world. And they were overrun. And in a desperate effort to try and save their lives, the officers let him out of the stockade, let him out of the cell along with all the other prisoners, and they were just told to take up arms and fight for their lives. And in the thick of the battle, he killed men and he saved the life of the commanding officer of the base, who it turned out was very well politically connected and also had his own code of ethics about what you owe someone who saves you from death. So Guard Bowman Du tells Hui, so overnight, a useless, drunken, out of control vagabond of a man went from being on death row to being a hero. And I was pardoned. I was transferred back into the main folds of the empire. I got a job at court, and I ended up being selected to go on the great expedition, the great flotilla going west. And I took that lesson properly of what fate was teaching me about my potential. And that's the secret of life, to do that, to get those big lessons.
To grab those opportunities when they come. And not only that, those opportunities might not look like opportunities when they come. They might be a sudden raid while you're sitting there contemplating what was at the time going to be a horrible future for doing something naughty. But yeah, you just don't know when life's going to throw you something that's going to make such a huge, you know, splash in your pond. Do you? It could be, you know, we so much look for opportunities that have kind of dressed up filled with glitter and flashing lights. But sometimes the opportunities, can come completely, well, to use a biblical phrase, like a thief in the night. They can catch you completely off guard, and you've got to be able to just go with it or not.
Exactly. Yeah, and the core idea of the Tao Te Ching, the book of Taoism, which, you know, I personally maintain is not actually a religion. It's a philosophical viewpoint. I say it's not a religion because actually it doesn't involve any deity or deities, and it doesn't involve any rules. And this is one of the things that's frustrated people about Taoism for years. And yet it's one of the most powerful, kind of insightful books if you read a translation of it. And it's had such a great impact on Chinese culture. And it's really the only native philosophical system of China. You know, Buddhism, which is part of China now in a big way, came from India, northern India, as we know. So it's actually a foreign philosophy. And other Chinese systems of thinking are divorced from any kind of ultimate cosmic image, like Confucianism is about social order and mutual obligation and ethics. It's almost Aristotelian in an Eastern way. Whereas the Tao Te Ching, the fundamental core of it is we can't know stuff, get used to it. We shouldn't sweat the small stuff. And fun fact, it's all small stuff. That's the real nature of life. That's the real nature of the universe. We don't know what things mean. And the moment somebody tells you in great detail that they know what they mean, know what everything means or something means, they are in error. They are off the path. This is not the Tao. This is not the way, which is just such a fascinating idea. And I notice it's come around again in the 21st century. It's become extremely important and comforting for a lot of people. And I think of, you know, contemporary author philosophers, people like, for example, Eckhart Tolle. You know, if you strip back a lot of what he's saying in his books, it's pure Taoism. It really is.
We're reaching a point where value is slipping away, in the sense of, from a point of view where everything is just in abundance to a certain degree. Everything's at our fingertips, and like we were having a little bit of a chat, before the old wonderful record button here, in the sense of, our lifestyle today is so different to the lives of the people that have lived in these historical times that we've been chatting about tonight. We basically have aligned ourselves with lots of toys. We definitely have an easy life compared to a lot of the past, and we have a lot of toys. But when we start seeking those answers, then a lot of the pathways we thought were going to get there, suddenly they're starting to crumble. And suddenly knowledge isn't everything. And at some point you find yourself, sometimes, I think, for some of us, standing there going, well, there is no way of knowing anything. And then where does that leave us? It leaves us knowing they're all little things, I suppose.
My wife, Jen, who's a very, very talented human being and one of the smartest people I've ever met, unfortunately is of the opinion that with the rise of AI, the world, or the era of real authorship and real writers telling real human stories, is about to come to an end, and that we're going to get to the point where the temptation to quote and unquote enhance everything or speed up the production of everything using AI, even in literature, is going to be too much for anybody to resist. And when, things like ChatGPT, which at the moment, is comparatively clumsy compared to what's going to happen in the next 6 iterations down the track, when that has reached a level of, seeming perfection, it's going to be impossible to stop, no matter what you put in a contract, no matter what you say in an interview, no matter what disclaimers you stamp in the front of your book. She thinks it's going to be impossible to stop publishers, authors, marketing people just really heavily depending on it, because that's human nature. Once cars were available, the horse was doomed as, a form of perennial transport. It was perennial no more. And that's just how it is with us humans. So there are people, and not just her saying that.
No, philosophy is definitely going to come to the forefront over the next couple of years. But where can readers and listeners find more of, follow you or learn more about all your books?
The best way is just to go to simonhiggins.net. That's simonhiggins.net, which my website is set up to be a kind of a one-stop shopping portal. You go to simonhiggins.net and you will see very prominently on there, at the bottom of the welcome page, and in fact at the bottom of every page, is displayed the links to checking out my Facebook page and also my YouTube archive. My YouTube page isn't constantly updated, but it's a bit of a library of short films and travel adventures. It's almost like a visual set of anecdotes. So you can see stuff I did in Japan, in China, some animations I've been associated with or have written. There's a whole lot of variety, and there's something for everyone on the YouTube side. And the Facebook page, of course, is updated very, very regularly with a lot of photographs of my travels, my life in China, flashbacks to Japan, talking about my books, my work, ideas, interactions, lots of stimulus there. And the website itself is something of an archive. It'll give you my backstory, lots of images and photographs, and a lot more information about the books, their blurbs, their contents and covers. And of course, apart from simonhiggins.net, also it's probably worth checking out my latest publisher, Undo Redo Press. I absolutely love the name of their publishing house, Undo Redo. It's just one of those things burnt into the 21st century human consciousness. Anyone who's got a bar at the top of their computer screen will be familiar with it. And they are a very creative little organization that involves acting, filmmaking, mentoring, and has a publishing wing. And they're the people I've chosen to put Dragons of Dusk and Dawn with, my latest work, and also some of the ebook reboots of my backlist. because I just like their very fresh and very audience-sensitive approach to things. SimonHiggins.net and undoredopress.com are the two things I would suggest people explore. And of course, Dragons of Dusk and Dawn is on Amazon. You can go to Amazon and do a search on the book name, or you can access the Amazon reading pages and ordering pages through my website or the publisher's website.
I can promise you there's a whole heap of books there covering a whole different range of genres. Readers, listeners, definitely jump onto Simon's website and go down this marvelous rabbit hole, because there is so much there to be found, so much treasure. But I have one more question. This is probably the most important question of all for you, Simon, before we let you go.
Okay.
When are you visiting Adelaide again?
My dream is 2024, but I'm not sure whether it's going to work out or not.
Oh, when's the last time you were back in Adelaide? I know you've been over there 10 years, but do you come back to visit, or?
I do. I was in Adelaide a few years ago, and just I took my wife around and showed her places of great significance in my life, and caught up with friends and relatives, and that was a lovely experience. Marveled at how many things had changed, and delighted secretly at a few things that had not, and just enjoyed myself. And I was actually very culturally triumphant, because I said to my wife, who is Chinese born and raised, I said, I'm going to show you how well I know my city, my old stomping ground. I'm going to take you down Rundle Mall. I'm going to show you the amazing sculptures. And then I'm going to take you to a couple of little cafes. And I guarantee you the music that will be playing will be really cool British music from the 80s, like The Cure and Style Council and Dexy's Midnight Runners and Culture Club and all this stuff. And I said, you watch. And she was skeptical. She was like, no, you've been away too long. Everything must change. I said, you watch. This is Adelaide, and I love it. And we went in there, and yep, some of my projected playlist came up in the space of us having one coffee.
Yeah.
So I am triumphant. I am triumphant.
That's a good way to be triumphant too. And Adelaide is look, it is a beautiful, and I say little city, because obviously, living where you do, those cities over there are just, beyond belief. I know that when I did Survivor over there, and then we stayed, I can't remember the city now, because we were in the jungles for quite a bit of it, but it was like this big 5-star hotel, like I think, just exotic in the middle of this huge city. And I stood in the shower, and I had like 15 different jets. So you had 5 around the top, 5 around the middle, 5 around the bottom, and you had to angle them all, and you hit the button, the water sprayed, and I had the thing open, and it was all windows, and I was just looking at, and it was beyond Blade Runner. And it's a big jump from Adelaide, but likewise, of course, my wife's from Japan, so I spent a lot of time over in, Osaka and Tokyo and all those places. So Adelaide, yes, it's definitely a little city, but it is an absolute little treasure. And like you said, you can almost be guaranteed that no matter where you are, you will be able to sit down and close your eyes, and you are in the 80s, which I think is a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Yes, absolutely.
And hey, look, there's so many big cities in the world, and you go to the one big city, and funnily enough, as other big cities get quite similar sometimes, it's the little cities that are different. So, but I do look forward to hopefully having, because I do have one more question, but this one we'll save for the Writers' Lounge when Veronica can join us, because now I've got backup when I ask you why Adelaide's a better city than Melbourne. So, Simon, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Congratulations on your new book. And look, we could talk for hours, and I really do, hope and look forward to the opportunity to talk with you again. This has been amazing. The book, I have no doubt, is going to go gangbusters, and I do hope that by all of our listeners, you'll gain many, many new readers. And I have no doubt that anyone who grabs one of your titles, whatever the genre they pick, they will fall in love, and then they have the joy of a whole library to go through, and you have the joy of new readers to start thinking about on your next book. But in the meantime, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Oh, thank you, Darren. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Shay Shay.
Thank you, mate. Xie xie.
There you go. Thank you so much to Simon and Darren for. I took pages of notes when I had a listen. You know, it's so
Same.
much.
Yes, same. It really got me into the fascinating alternate reality, fate versus destiny. I was listening to all of that thinking I have to come back. I'm going to re-listen to this over and over again. It always spurs such wonderful conversation, those sorts of that focus, and it's so interesting.
Yes, yeah, and Darren always has such an existential slant on his conversations,
Yes.
and you go, "Don't you write horror?" Yes, he does, but
Yes,
his horror is always existential stuff. It's amazing.
That's it. And from a science fiction point of view, it's fascinating to me with the alternate realities and the do we plan out? Are we on a path and stuck with the path that we choose, or do we have choice? Oh. I can get into it for hours, but I won't.
Leave it. All right. Some of the things I've got here are, battlefields and poetry.
The history is beautiful.
Yes.
Him putting those together and the way the culture, he's brought out the cultures in his storytelling is just stunning.
And really immersive. It's almost like, what is that, actor's method or something, where you actually go and immerse yourself in something, and, going to Japan and really doing his martial arts and becoming absorbing himself in the culture. And really, I love the kind of moving and reinventing himself. It's all the way through. Explore yourself in those things that really speak to you.
It's that. That's right.
Yeah.
So
lots
very much particularly with when we were talking about. Sorry, we're now talking over each other. Oh no!
Keep going. We're excited.
I was just going to say very quickly that it's different types of stories. So the young adult to the adult fiction that he writes, and in so many different genres, which we were talking about last week, which is a real skill set. And you should be writing what you enjoy.
Yes.
What you find interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. and not be constrained by whoever says that you should only do one thing, very good. The character hijack, I love. I very recognise that you start writing and think you've got it, and then all of a sudden you're going off in a completely different direction. You go, what the hell?
Yep.
Where did that come from?
Yep. And they'll tell you. They will tell you if they don't like the direction you're going in, because that's when I find that's when I stall, and that's where I get a bit of writer's block. It's because I'm not listening to the characters and because they're driving the story. Once I get back into that headset, everything flows again. Yeah.
There you go. Well, so many things. And, the world being blended and fate and testing your limits, and Adelaide in the 80s as they finished. But, Darren, I still think Melbourne is the best city in the world. But, we'll leave that.
Our coffee is marvellous. Yep.
Yes. All right. So, again, thank you, Simon Higgins. Good luck with Dragons of Dusk and Dawn, which, I really quite like the anime cover. And one of my daughters is a mad anime, Ruby and all of those things. I don't know if you know Ruby. Have you ever watched Ruby? WBY?
Oh, I don't think so.
Yeah, you have to have a look at that. I mean, that's fabulous. But anyway, that's a tale for another day. This is long enough as it is. Give us your quote, Laurie.
Oh, my quote. Yes. Okay. This one, I really like this one. So within the science fiction space, memory and regret are, when taken together, the set of necessary and sufficient elements required to produce a time machine.
Wow.
Which is by Charles Yu said that one. And I think that's spot on. It reminded me with Simon's talk, actually, and his interview with Darren. It's that memory and that creates that time, the sense of past and going back into the past, and historical fiction and all of that sort of thing. It just science fiction's everywhere. I love it.
It is. Yes, we're sensing a certain flavour to your conversations, but that's
Indeed.
all right. All right, I thought I'd give you one by Maya Angelou, who is one of my favourite authors. And of course, for anybody who doesn't know, Maya is sadly died in 2014. But yeah, she's an American. They call her a memoirist and poet, and I've read some of her work, and I love listening to her talk. This one is: history, despite the wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I really like that.
That's beautiful. I really like that. And again, talking about that sense of past and history and future.
Yes, yeah, and reinventing yourself and doing all those kind of things. So yeah, no, I quite like that. So thank you, Maya, as always. Yeah, beautiful soul. That is it, I think.
Yes.
Well, I don't think we'll put a book review on the end because this is going to be a long enough recording as it is. We will see you in the next episode. But if you love Australian book lovers, please check us out on YouTube, where you'll see we're fiddling with our backgrounds and learning to put the music in and all those kind of things.
Yes.
If you want to get fabulous Australian books, where do we go, Laurie?
We come to Australian Book Lovers,
Yeah.
our website,
Yes.
which
Yep. It's just
I'm not as familiar with you. It is just AustralianBookLovers.com. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But I was thinking we're also online on Instagram,
Yes.
Threads,
Yes.
LinkedIn, YouTube, X.
Yeah.
No one calls it X.
No,
Twitter.
no, Twitter.
So you can find us everywhere.
Yes.
And please, if you are a reader and you'd like to receive a semi-regular newsletter full of excellent Aussie authored books and giveaways, then jump onto the website and subscribe.
Beautiful. That's lovely. And because you can't see, I've still got those books on my desk, but absolutely, after I do my tax this weekend, don't ask me which year I'm doing my tax for. We'll just move on. ATO, you didn't hear. These are not the tax you're looking for. Yeah. So I will be doing the newsletter this week and shooting that out to our subscribers. And we'll talk about who wins that in the next episode. Because as you know, it is To the River, The Rewilding, and The White Cockatoo Flowers. Yeah, and those books are on the website, and I'm going to pop those up as features of the week.
So subscribe now.
Subscribe now. Be super quick. Hopefully we'll get this episode out. Yes. You can send me an email if you think you really want one of these books for free, people, for free. So many beautiful books out there. That's it, because we need to remind you, though,
Yes,
to
read
more Aussie
books.
Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.
Australian Book Lovers acknowledges First Nations peoples and recognises their continuous connection to country, community and to culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and honour the sharing of traditional stories passed down through generations. We're committed to a safe and inclusive welcome for authors and readers of all cultures and backgrounds, including people of LGBTQIA+ communities and their families. Let's meet again, where magic happens.